Hello everyone, I'm reading the book of the great people in the Bible and how they live. And I'm starting in part 1. I don't want to read the introduction because so many pages. So the part 1 is the seekers of the promised land. So Abraham took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions, and these sallied forth to go to the land of Canaan. That's in Genesis 12:5. In Canaan, the presence of towns in the valleys and dolmens, or prehistoric tombstone structures like that on the ridge at center, reminded Hebrews they were sojourners in an ancient culture. So the Canaanites were sometimes hostile, but pasturage was plentiful on the sparsely settled hillside where patriarchal tribes pitched their tents and grazed their flocks. So within the camp, the women churned butter in goatskin bags and did other chores. So while the younger men tended in the tribe sheep and goats, led their donkeys on traveling expedition, and stood guard. From the elders of the tribe came social and religious leadership that enabled patriarchal Hebrew culture to survive and flourish in alien lands. So go from country and your kindred and your father house of the land that I will show you. That's in Genesis 12:1. The commanded by the Lord to Abraham began the great age of the patriarch, 7 centuries that culminated in the founding of a new nation by Moses. So the founding fathers of ancient Israel were the patriarchs. So leaders of Hebrew clan that settled in Canaan some 1800 years before the birth of Jesus. So the first of them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, made covenants or agreements with the Lord in return for their complete faith in Him. He promised His protection and favor and a land of their own. The 12 sons of Jacob, including Joseph, were considered patriarch too and became the namesake of the 12 tribes of Israel. Later, the prophet Moses welded these tribes into a nation and set the stage for the conquest of the promised land. So compared to the Canaanites, the Hebrews, who first appeared sometime after 2000 BC, were primitive semi-nomadic herdsmen to whom the settled routine of farming was an entirely new way of life. So the established nations of the Near East had seen wandering peoples come out of the surrounding mountains and deserts for centuries. So sometimes the nomads came in great, wearing hordes, leveling the civilized societies in their path. Sometimes they came in relative peace, so trading and occasionally robbing, so driving their flocks and herds before them, avoiding the towns. So in Abraham's time, there were numerous Semitic tribes migrating from Mesopotamia into Canaan, and the Hebrews numbered only few among many. So it is understandable then why there were no references to them in the records of the Amorites. So Hittites, Canaanites, and Egyptians, through whose lands they passed. So the powerful nation had more important problems to contend with than incursion of relatively small band of herdsmen and caravanners. So in the more than 5,000 years before Abraham's birth, the peoples of the ancient Near East had witnessed the rise of the world's first civilization. So men and women in Mesopotamia and Egypt had started that rise by gradually abandoning the cave dwelling, animal hunting life their people had led for untold thousands of years. So instead, they now began to live in small towns, to grow crops and to domesticate animals. So eventually, they cooperated with each other, performed such great tasks as the draining of the marshes in lower Mesopotamia and the irrigation of the land adjoining the Nile River. So that cooperation led to the development of the first cities. So within those cities, the arts and crafts of civilization began to emerge. Writing, building, trade, transportation, and organized religion, among others. So the first true civilization were those of Sumer in Mesopotamia and Egypt. So the chief city of Sumer was Ur. So their men raised a great step pyramid or ziggurat to the city god. So at about the same time in Egypt, Pharaoh Khufu built the great pyramid that was to be his tomb. So the pattern of civilized life first developed of Sumer was the basis for the great Mesopotamian civilization that would succeed it for the next 2,000 years. So in the 24th century BC, the first of these successors conquered the original peoples of Sumer. So these were the Akkadians, Semitic people with whom the Sumerians had coexisted for hundreds of years. Their leader was Sargon, founder of great dynasty in Akkad. At the height of his reign, Sargon controlled all of Mesopotamia and Syria, the land between northwest Mesopotamia and Canaan. And his heirs remained in power for nearly 2 centuries. So the Akkadian dynasty, the world's first great empire, raised the level of civilization throughout all of Western Asia. So shortly before the year 2000 BC, the whole Near East entered a dark, turbulent period. All across the Fertile Crescent, waves of people known to as Amorites invaded and overturned the old centers of powers. The Amorites were Semitic tribesmen, seminomads who had been living on the fringes of northwest Mesopotamia and making frequent raids against city-state throughout the area. By the beginning of the second millennium, Amorite kings gained control over most of the north, and within 2 centuries, nearly every important city in Mesopotamia was ruled by Amorites. So throughout these turbulent years, there were great population movement across the Near East. So many originating in the early Amorite centers in northern Syria and Mesopotamia. Around this time, Amorite tribesmen poured into Canaan, causing the abandonment of towns across the countryside and destroying major cities like Jericho, Megiddo, and Ai. So the disorders gradually declined, and armed invasion gave way to more peaceful migration of nomadic clans. So some of these settled in Syria, where there eventually founded a group of powerful city-states held by Ogarit, Carchemish, Aleppo, and Katna. So others wandered farther south into Transjordan, Palestine, and even Egypt. So among these wanderers, seeking grazing ground for their flocks were the patriarchs. In later time, ancient Israelites, school children were taught to recite their nation's history, beginning with the words, "A wandering Aramean was my father." So the Bible records that Abraham came to Canaan from Haran. So in northwest Mesopotamia, it was around Haran that the Aramean clans, part of the Amorite population, set out on their migrations. So through Abraham made his journey during the same period. So we can't be certain that his ancestor came from near Haran. Indeed, one passage in Genesis 11:31 says that Abraham's father, Terah, moved his family to Haran from Ur, so the Sumerian capital in southern Mesopotamia. So however, the oldest existing text of the Bible, Greek translation from the 3rd century BC, makes no mention of Ur at all, and many experts believe that passage was later addition, or at best that Ur was simply a major stop during the nomadic travels of the Amorites. So moreover, the findings of archaeologists and scholars indicate that Israel's roots were not in southern Mesopotamia, but in the north. Several members of Abraham's family, including his brother Haran and Nahor, had names almost identical to the names of towns in the Aramean region. So other names, including Abraham and Jacob, were simply variation of Amorite personal names. So the customs of the patriarchs described in the Bible are also of this region in northern Mesopotamia. So thanks to a fascinating group of clay tablets found in the ruins of Notsi, a city in the north, where can now explain some of incidents in the patriarchal stories that have perplexed readers for years. So the Nazians were people who took over most of the northern Mesopotamia in the 16th and 15th century BC. They preserved many old Amorite laws and customs and recorded some of them on the clay tablets. So from this, we have learned, for example, that it was a common and respectable for a man whose wife was barren to use her maidservant for childbearing, as Abraham and Jacob both did. So the kind of deathbed blessing by which Jacob became Isaac's here was also common. So, and it was apparently irrevocable even when obtained under false pretenses, as when Jacob stole Esau's. Next is Abraham's in Canaan. So the people Abraham led into Canaan were a clan of seminomads, probably numbering no more than a few hundreds. So who depended on their sheep, goats, and cattle for a living. So Abraham remained in the hills and southern region of Canaan. So leading his tribe and flocks through the countryside between Dothan in the central hills and Beersheba on the edge of the Negev. So this hill country was a good area for the newcomers. So though rugged and heavily wooded, it offered adequate grazing land and was only sparsely settled, lowering the chances of friction with their native populations. So in other parts of Palestine, there was a great upsurge of commerce and urban life in 19th century BC, at about the time of the Hebrew arrival. So cities destroyed many centuries before were rebuilt. So and new towns founded, the incoming tribes settled down within a short time of the newcomers. So had adopted the language of Canaan and marks of its culture. So when the patriarch arrived in Canaan, the two most important Canaanite cities were Gezer, which dominated the southern coastal plain, and Megiddo in the north. So aside from this, there were a great many flourishing towns in the lower Jordan Valley and the area to the east known as Transjordan. Then there were the notorious cities of the plain, south of the Dead Sea. So the best known of these cities were Sodom and Gomorrah, infamous for the sinfulness that brought down the Lord's awesome wrath. The next is the life of the seminomads. This is the life of the seminomads. This is how they lived before. As long as they remained in Canaan, Abraham's people clung to their semi-nomadic ways. So they continued to move from place to place, always in search for fresh pastures and reliable water supply. So they lived in tents, and whenever possible, they set up their camps near larger towns like Dothan. So Shechem and Bethel for security. So their main base was the purchased burial ground of Machpelah, where they planted grain each spring. So the sort of existence was not really austere or difficult as it might seem to modern reader. So a contemporary Egyptian story about a youth who fled to Canaan give us a good idea of what life was like for the early Hebrews. So, another source, a tomb painting at Beni Hassan in southern Egypt, has added further details to our knowledge of the patriarchal way of life. So the painting dates from about 1900 BC and shows a family of Semitic seminomads entering Egypt. So their colorful clothing, weapons, tools, and other belongings all show that while not on the advanced level of civilization, they were certainly no band of Raj or barbarians. So they have knowledge of the craft of sheep herding, metalworking, copper, and pottery making. So though the patriarchs never really settled down, each of them came to be linked with one or two particular places. So after Lot's departure from Bethel, for example, Abraham found a new site about 25 miles of the south. So Abraham moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron. So that's Genesis 13:18. So he continued to wander, but he always returned to Mamre. So there he bought a tract of land surrounding the cave of Machpelah, which he had chosen to be his family's burial place. With this, the nomad became a landowner, and so doing, Abraham planted the roots of tradition that would draw his descendants back to Canaan some 600 years later. So Abraham's son is Isaac, and his grandson Jacob also established ties with particular places in the hill country. So Isaac wandering were centered in the neighborhood of southern Canaan near Beersheba, while Jacob roamed farther north, most often around Shechem and Bethel. Next is the religion of the patriarch. So stones, altars, and pillars of the kind that both Abraham and Jacob erected to the Lord were frequently raised in the Near East. They were often memorials for a covenant or sacred vow. So sometimes between two men, but more than between a man and a God. So such covenants were basically private agreements or contract, similar in phrasing to political treaties of the day. In them, a man would vow to worship a particular god in return for aid and protection. So this concept of a personal god was the foundation of the Hebrew early faith. So the covenant between the Lord and Abraham is described in chapter 15 and 17 in Genesis. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. And I will give you and to your descendants after you all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possessions, and I will be their God. That's in Genesis 17:7-8. So in return, Abraham and his descendants were to signify their fidelity to the Lord by the ritual of circumcision. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. That's in Genesis 17:13. So although the early Hebrews worshipped the God of Abraham, they did not deny the existing of their deities. On one occasion, Abraham made an explicit oath to Elyon, God Most High, the Creator God of both Amorite and Canaanite belief. And it seems the patriarchs' religion was often practiced side by side with local cults. So in fact, the idea of a covenant described in terms of a family relationship of God is Canaanite. So later Israel, the figures of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, embodied the distant past from which their nation had emerged in the course of many generations. The patriarch stories were shaped and written to emphasize the spiritual destiny that made Israel different from other nations. So a destiny summed up in God's promise to Abraham. These stories gave Israel feeling to continuity with the past, recreating the nation's origins from the earliest days in Haran to the arrival of Joseph and his brother in Egypt. Next is Joseph in Egypt. So Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, was sold into slavery in Egypt. By his brother around 1700 BC, he quickly rose from the adversity to become the most powerful minister of the Pharaoh. His history is full of details that modern scholars have been able to connect to historical facts. So the idea that Joseph, a Hebrew slave, could have become the Pharaoh's highest governing official is not as fanciful as it might sound. About the time of his arrival between 1720 and 1700 BC, so Egypt was invaded by Syro-Canaanite alliance called the Hyksos by the Egyptians. These invaders established their own line of pharaohs and ruled the country for about 150 years. Hated foreigners themselves, it was likely that the Hyksos might trust someone like Joseph sooner than they would a native Egyptian. And the account Joseph's rise to power has undeniable authentic flavor. Another part of the narrative, in which the pharaohs acquired most of the country's land during a famine, would be easy to understand in Egypt had been under the Hyksos. So Joseph's ability to interpret dreams certainly have attracted attention in Egypt, where the ancient arts of magic and divining were highly respected. Also, the various titles given Joseph by Potiphar and the Pharaoh are exact translation of the Egyptians' offices, and the description of Joseph's swearing as a prime minister came from someone familiar with such ceremonies. Joseph's reunion with his brother is another event that mirrors historical condition. It was a period of famine throughout the Near East. The famine was severe all over the earth in Genesis 41:57. And according to the Egyptian text, certain of the foreigners who know not how they should live have come begging a home in the domain of Pharaoh. So there was often surplus grain in the Pharaoh's storehouses, and in time of hardship of famine, it was apparently old Egyptian policy to allow nomads from other countries into the land. So the region of Goshen in the fertile Nile Delta could sustain great numbers of people and their flocks, and would have been the logical place for a Hebrews to settle. Thus Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possession in it, and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Genesis 47:27. According to the Bible, Joseph lived to be 110 years old, the traditional length of a full and happy life in Egyptian lore. Nearing his death, Joseph called his brother together. "I am about to die," he told them, "but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." That's in Genesis 50:24. Here, again, the great promise was repeated. This had been the basis of the patriarchs' faith. So the covenant God had made with them, now they were in Egypt and could only wait for the Lord to make good his vow. Next is slaves of the Pharaoh. So the book of Exodus opened after an interlude some 400 years. So it was the beginning of the 13th century BC. That's in 13th century BC. The Hyksos had long since been driven out, and Egypt was profoundly changed. So the powerful landed aristocrats of Joseph's time no longer existed. Their place taken by a new class of royal officials and bureaucrats. Nearly all the land in Egypt was owned by the Pharaoh, and the great number of people who lived and worked on it were entirely at his mercy. So during the period leading up to the Exodus, Egypt was ruled by two pharaohs. Seti, the first, that's in 1308 to 1290 BC, and his son Ramesses II. That's in 1290 to 1224 BC. So it was apparently Seti who enslaved the Hebrews and other foreign people living in Egypt. During his reign, Egypt was asserting itself again as a lion that had fragmented Egypt empire in Canaan and Syria. So he also began to rebuild the old Hyksos capital, Avaris, in the Nile Delta. So the pharaohs who succeeded the Hyksos had moved their capital back to the Thebes in the south. But Seti chose to revive Avaris as the seat of his government, probably to keep an eye on Canaan. So this work could only be done by forced labor, and the task undoubtedly fell hardest on the foreign population, including the Hebrews living in the Nile Delta. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. That's in Exodus 1:13 to 14. So Seti's policies were continued vigorously by Ramesses II, who reigned marked Egypt's last flourish of real power in the Near East. So Ramesses finished subduing Canaan, so fought the mighty Hittite Empire to a stalemate in Syria, and enjoyed great prestige and relative peace for the last 50 years of his life. At home, he planned numerous building projects to glorify his kingdom, including the completion of rebuilt Avaris, which was renamed says of his honor. So the splendor of the finished city soon became legendary. The most striking creation was a magnificent temple, flanked by two colossal granite statues of the Pharaoh that stood 40 feet high. So all this grandeur took a heavy toll in human suffering. So the Hebrews and other foreigners were conscripted in the labor battalions, condemned to the brick fields and stone quarries for as long as it pleased the Pharaoh. And the people of Israel groaned under their bondage and cried out for help. That's in Exodus 2:23. So that time seems to have come for Israel, God to reveal himself, to deliver the Hebrews out of bondage and redeem his ancient promise. So it was that Moses reared in the court of the Pharaoh, but then a Hebrew shepherd herding his flock in the Sinai Peninsula was called to lead his people out of Egypt. Here began the dramatic story of the Pharaoh's refusal to release the Hebrews and the succession of plagues which God sent down in reprisal. The last one killing of all the firstborn children in Egypt, but miraculously passing over those of the Hebrews. The Jews later celebrated this event in the Passover holiday. With this, the Bible says that terrified Pharaoh summoned Moses and his brother Aaron and told them, "Rise up, go forth from among my people. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said," and began. That's in Exodus 12:32. The next is Moses and the Exodus. So organizing a motley crowd of perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people, Moses set out across the marshes of the Red Sea. So escaping the charioteers that the Pharaoh had sent in the last-minute change of heart, he then turned south toward the region of Mount Sinai, where he had first received the Lord's call. So to avoid Egyptian fortresses in the northern part of the peninsula. It was here that Moses went up on the mountain to receive the law and make the covenant binding Israel forever to the God of the fathers. It is impossible to judge the accuracy of the details in the Exodus story. So the biblical count we have was not actually written down until 400 years later. So until then, the story had been passed down by word of mouth. Egyptian records of Moses' time make no mention of the Hebrews' escape. But ancient kings were not in the habit of recording of their defeats. So it seems like that the group which escaped from Egypt included other slaves as well as the Hebrew descendants of Jacob. So these others would not have been familiar with the promise the Lord made to patriarchs. Nevertheless, most of them were absorbed in the Israelite tribes and religion. There is no reason to doubt that the Hebrews did escape from Egypt during the reign of Ramesses II, and this exodus was a crucial event in the faith of Israel. So the faith of the patriarchs had been based on a divine promise, and the Exodus was interpreted as a divine act which would lead to the fulfillment of that promise. With the Exodus, the real history of Israel as a nation began. So Egypt was behind them, and the promised land lay ahead. So most important, the Lord had shown that that his power was equal to the ancient pledge he had made to Abraham. "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." That's in 12:2. So that's the end of the story of the part 1 in seekers of the promised land. So the next story is, I will read that in the next video, which is the pioneers in the promised land, which Abraham and Isaac. Thanks for watching. God bless everyone. Bye.